This is a presentation on Unit 8 by Will Bond, Josie Light, Hannah Min, Cy Chinden, and Kyle Silman.
Incentives for American imperialism, Anglo-Saxonism, and American acquisition of Hawaii. Some incentives for U.S. imperialism. There's growth of domestic agricultural and industrial markets, which resulted in workers looking to sell to foreign markets. There's also a new sense of power that the U.S. gained after receiving a burst of population growth at the turn of the 20th century. There's international competition, such as the scramble for Africa, and it also would increase the U.S. military readiness, as it would allow for the U.S. to establish colonies, furthermore military bases that could prepare the U.S. for war. Anglo-Saxonism, it was the belief that Americans should spread their cultural values to foreign people. The acquisition of Hawaii. In 1983, the U.S. deposes the Queen of Hawaii. And finally, in 1898, Hawaii is annexed under the presidency of McKinley. The Spanish-American War in the terms of the Treaty of Paris. The Spanish-American War, 1895, there was a Cuban revolt against Spain. The Cuban insurrectos rose up against the Spanish oppressors. The Cubans were upset because of the economic troubles due to an 1894 U.S. tariff which rose sugar prices. Yellow journalism in the United States also encouraged the U.S. to join the fight, as it portrayed the Spanish general as a butcher and extremely cruel to both the insurrectos and Americans. In 1898, there was the explosion of the USS Maine. This finally convinced the U.S. to join in the Spanish-American War. Once in the war, one of the most famous groups fighting for the U.S. was the Rough Riders. It was organized by Teddy Roosevelt. The war was fought in Cuba and the Philippines. Terms of the Treaty of Paris. After winning the war, Spain eventually gave up the rights to Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines.
In April 1898, Senator Henry Teller of Colorado proposed an amendment that became known as the Teller Amendment. This was an amendment to the United States Declaration of War against Spain, which stated the United States would not establish permanent control over Cuba. It stated the United States hereby disclaims any disposition of intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over said island, except for pacification thereof, and asserts its determination, when that is accomplished, to leave the government and control of the island to its people. The Platt Amendment succeeded the Teller Amendment and stated the United States had the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty. Next, we'll talk about the progressive movement. Progressivism is a term applied to a variety of responses to the economic and social problems rapid industrialization introduced to America. Progressivism began as a social movement and grew into a political movement. They were people who believed that the problems society faced, such as poverty, violence, greed, racism, and class warfare, could best be addressed by providing good education, a safe environment, and an efficient workplace. The main goals of the progressive era include purification of the corrupt government, modernization, a focus on family and education, prohibition, and women's suffrage. Muckrackers is the term given to the reform-minded American journalists who expose the corruptions and flaws in various parts of American life. Trust had come to be a fighting word in the progressive era. Roosevelt thought that the industrial behemoths, with their efficient means of production, were there to stay. He thought that good trust had public consciences, while bad trust lusted greedily for power. Roosevelt used his power to become a trust buster. However, he never used the maximum amount of power that he had. There are lots of ways that the huge industrial behemoths were healthier and more tame at the end of Roosevelt's reign than they had been before.
American mobilization for World War I and the role of women. American mobilization for World War I consisted of their army draft and industrialization of weapons because of how small and limited the army was at the time. The War Industries Board was in charge for the purchases of war supplies. Led by Frank Scott, the WIB dealt with labor management disputes, which ultimately led to an increase in demand for war supplies during World War I. With the men gone, due to the draft, there was a massive demand and opening for labor-intensive jobs that the women would soon take over. However, they received lower wages for doing the same work, and thus began some of the earliest demands for equal pay. The 14 points at the Treaty of Versailles. The 14 Points was a speech by President Woodrow Wilson in which Wilson addressed his vision for long-lasting peace in Europe, the Americas, and the rest of the world following World War I. He went before the U.S. Senate to present the Treaty of Versailles, including the Covenant of League of Nations, the organization that Wilson had envisioned in his famous 14-point speech of 1918. The speech was translated and distributed to the soldiers and citizens of Germany and Austria-Hungary and contributed to their decision. The presidential election of 1920. The presidential election of 1920, held on November 2nd, 1920, in which Republican Warren G. Harding defeated Democrat James M. Cox in a landslide. Harding promised a return to normalcy, which was, in essence, a movement away from the internationalism of Wilson. The only part of the country that didn't go heavily for Harding was the Deep South. The result was an overwhelming victory, the largest deficit between candidates in a century, 60% to 34%. The election also featured vice presidential candidates who would each become presidents: Calvin Coolidge and Franklin D. Roosevelt.
The conservation movement and the failures of the progressive era. The conservation movement was a movement that took place in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. The conservation movement is a political and social movement that seeks to protect natural resources, including animal and plant species, as well as their habitat for the future. And one reason why the conservation movement really took off in the late 1800s is because of the Roosevelt administration. Roosevelt was a very important spokesperson for the conservation efforts, and he dedicated 230 million acres of land to the National Park Service and founded the first bird sanctuary. And as for the failures of the progressive era coincided with the Jim Crow era, which saw intense segregation and discrimination of African Americans. This was a failure because in their attempt to end racism, they just created harsh segregation between blacks and whites. And in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, where they ruled in favor of separate but equal, the progressives lost because they were fighting to end segregation. Also, progressives never united on a single economic goal because one progressive president would argue for federal regulation on big business, while another progressive president would argue for open competition in economics. Taft feud. Throughout Roosevelt's presidency, Roosevelt was mentoring Taft to become his successor, but when Roosevelt stepped down and Taft became president in 1908, his political ideals changed. Taft based his administration on a more business-centric and limited government form of republicanism, which is in direct conflict with Roosevelt's progressive vision. Roosevelt then felt the need to run in the election of 1912 to combat Taft. Roosevelt then created his own branch of republicanism and founded the Bull Moose Party. This ended up hurting the Republican Party because this split the Republican supporters' votes, which helped the Democratic Party. Therefore, Woodrow Wilson and the Democratic Party won the election of 1912. Some reforms during the Wilson administration is the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, which became the central banking system of the United States. Also, the Keating-Owen Act, which ended child labor. He also drafted the 19th Amendment, which allowed for women's suffrage. And lastly, he activated the National War Labor Board, which improved working conditions in factories by insisting on 8-hour workdays and better safety conditions.
Approaching the 1900s, imperialistic powers such as Russia and Germany began to approach China. Worried Americans urged the government to take action due to the threat the foreign countries were suddenly beginning to impose on their interests. Influenced by the diplomatic letters that urged the great powers to respect Chinese rights and free competition within their spheres of influence, the open-door policy sought to ensure access to the Chinese market for the United States, even though America did not have a formal sphere of influence in China. Around 1900, the Spanish-American War revealed a necessity for a canal in order to bolster the strength of Navy and merchant mobility and protection of recent U.S. acquisitions, such as Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and the Philippines. The Hay-Bosworth Treaty in 1901 gave the U.S. the right to build the Panama Canal and conceded the right to fortify it. Issues, however, arose between the U.S. and Colombia, which ultimately led to weaker relations between Latin America and the United States. The Roosevelt Corollary was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine made by Theodore Roosevelt in his 1904 annual message to Congress. As a policy of prevention-intervention, it stated that the United States would have the right to take over domestic affairs of Latin America in order to restore military and financial order in the continent, fearing that the Germans or British would try to involve themselves with Latin America. However, this new addition mainly resulted in weakened relations with the displeased Latin Americans. As for America's reaction to the dawn of World War I, at first, America was seeking to remain separated from the war. They were relieved to know that they had oceans separating them from Europe and momentarily felt secure despite the rising war. President Wilson also wanted to remain passive and issued a neutrality proclamation at the dawn of the war. There were several factors that ultimately led to America's participation in World War I, many of which were caused by German actions. Issues surrounding German U-boats were noticed when the British Lusitania was torpedoed, effectively killing nearly 1,200 lives, 128 of them American. There was also the exchange between German Secretary Arthur Zimmermann and the Mexicans' Foreign Alliance, which was revealed in the Zimmermann Note, promising Mexico the recovery of land which had been obtained by the U.S., further infuriating the American public. Finally, on January 31, 1917, taking a big risk, Germany had announced the decision to wage unrestricted submarine warfare on all ships, including those within America's war zones, and within 2 weeks German U-boats sank 4 unarmed merchant vessels. America had stayed out of the war, believing that doing so would leave them relatively unharmed. When German warfare proved otherwise, America finally decided to actively participate in the war.